The resumption of the Chinese Civil War is one of the first post-World War II conflicts that would significantly influence the emerging Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. The Chinese Civil War is a complex period within China itself and internationally. The scope of this video series will be primarily focused on the actions of the nationalists and communists in the post-war phase of their ongoing conflict, as well as its impact on the wider Cold War. This first video will provide context for the following videos, which will dive more deeply into the last decisive phase of the Chinese Civil War to show what influenced the outcome of the conflict. These videos will cover the conflict from several angles, including factions, international actions, economics, geography, army movements, and domestic politics. Initially somewhat neglected by the international community, the Chinese Civil War grew in scope and importance to the two main victors of the Second World War. The actions of the Soviet and Americans were initially somewhat aligned in their want to avoid a wider conflict in China, until both would start to see the potential outcomes for the impending global struggle. Both the United States and the Soviets initially viewed China as a secondary or even tertiary theater. Stalin had a negative opinion of the Chinese communists before and during World War II, but began to see their potential usefulness as a tool against the West. And, on the other hand, the United States had a complex relationship with the nationalist Chinese, who were considered an ally of necessity, yet both the US and the nationalists had different plans for what China was supposed to be. Near the end of the war, both the Soviets and Americans saw little to gain from actively involving themselves in what they considered a domestic conflict. When the Civil War resumed in full force, both began to realize the opportunity and potential long-term consequences of a communist or nationalist China in regards to the Cold War and East Asia. Domestically, China itself was in a war-torn and exhausted state from a constant civil war and the Japanese invasion. This would not be enough to prevent the continuation of the Civil War. The two factions had eventually emerged from Sun Yat-sen's revolution to unify China to establish a republic. Initially, both the factions were unified under KMT and the National Revolutionary Army to unite China under a single government by fighting regional warlords for centralized unification. Sun's death in 1925 and distrust between left and right elements in the KMT, previously kept in check by Sun, began to boil over. This led the General Chiang Kai-shek, who assumed the mantle as Sun's successor, to launch an expedition against regional warlords in 1926 into central and northern China to establish a new central government. In 1927, while the expedition was ongoing, Chiang ordered the purging of communist elements within the KMT, who then violently revolted, starting the Chinese Civil War. Eventually, over the course of the 1920s and the early 1930s, the communists and nationalists would battle each other for control over urban and southern China, in which the nationalists would emerge victorious. The largest communist state established in Jiangxi province was then defeated in 1934, and the remnants of the Chinese Communist Party were forced to flee north in the Long March to escape the advancing nationalist forces. The CCP would, over the course of the Long March, and due to a string of several more setbacks from senior leadership, fall under the centralized control of Mao Zedong. In the rugged terrain of the northern Chinese countryside, the CCP began the process of regaining their strength. The remaining CCP forces that survived the Long March fled north, led by Mao Zedong. Its rebuilding efforts focused on the Chinese countryside and shoring up support of the peasantry, primarily in northern and central base areas. This was by fighting against regional warlords, the Japanese, and by implementing land reforms. During the Japanese invasion in 1937, both the CCP and the KMT temporarily ceased overt hostility to focus on stopping the invading Japanese. This truce was ultimately not in effect by 1941, leaving both parties to fight the Japanese in their own respective holdings, with two distinctively separate armies. Communist actions against the Japanese were suited to the strengths of the communists in perpetuating a guerrilla warfare in the countryside using hit-and-run tactics against the Japanese. CCP forces learned vital lessons in mobile warfare and organization during their guerrilla campaign against the Japanese that would be later applied to the upcoming resumption of the Civil War. KMT forces fiercely fought the Japanese in a more conventional sense and suffered severe losses in defending the most economically and strategically vital areas of China. These areas were along the Yellow River and in the urban centers in the north and on the coastline. Continued regionalism, outdated tactics and strategy, lack of materials, lack of equipment necessary for modern war, and a loss of thousands of experienced NCOs early in the war combined to limit the effectiveness of the KMT military. Efforts for large-scale army reform necessary to fight the Japanese were prevented by the KMT's fragmented political situation. Significant industrialization to support a modern army was not begun until war with Japan seemed inevitable. Chiang Kai-shek's planned to deal with the remaining communists before the Japanese. This led to animosity among some of his top generals, and in an incident meant to force him to focus on the Japanese threat, Chiang was kidnapped and forced to join the United Front. This cooperation between both didn't last, as the KMT and the CCP did not trust each other, and both sides overall failed to meaningfully coordinate united defenses against the Japanese. The central government only completely controlled its own centralized forces, and the regionalists controlled the other significant portion, with their own goals and ambitions, subject to rivalries and power dynamics. KMT forces fought exceptionally fiercely against the Japanese, especially in the city of Shanghai and the province of Wuhan, but they were continually pushed back by Japanese offensives that outmaneuvered and overwhelmed KMT forces through superior firepower, mechanization, and tactical superiority. The aforementioned Battle of Shanghai was fought with some of the most experienced and centralized units of the KMT army, fighting a brutal defense of the city that was eventually outflanked by a Japanese naval landing. This battle took an exceptional toll on KMT forces, which afterwards were unable to mount a strong enough resistance to prevent the fall of Nanking. The fighting between the KMT and Japanese took an extensive toll on the civilian population, leading to major large-scale atrocities committed in Chinese cities and in the countryside. The KMT capital was moved inland to Wuhan, and then after Wuhan became untenable in 1938, Chongqing would then become the capital for the rest of the war. The Japanese would eventually suspend large-scale offensive operations after the costly taking of Wuhan province, due to the Khalkhin Gol incident and impending war with other Western powers. Japanese bombers continued to indiscriminately bomb Chinese cities with conventional and chemical weapons. The successful Operation Ichigo in 1944 would be the last significant Japanese offensive against the KMT to secure a supply route through China due to the US destroying the Japanese merchant fleet in the South Pacific. This would be another significant blow to KMT forces. The KMT did manage victories against the Japanese, seriously boosting morale of the army, but the KMT military simply lacked the unity and material to follow up these victories with significant strategic gains.